The doctor didn't whisper when he gave the news. He looked at the clock and said that if 7-year-old Sandra didn't eat by tonight, her heart would simply stop beating. It wasn't a threat, it was a promise, and Officer Jonathan Cruz knew that if he walked out that door and followed the rules, the little girl staring at the empty spot on the floor would be gone by morning. Grab your coffee and stay with me, because this isn't just about a stolen dog. It is about a man breaking every rule to save a child before the sun came up. The house on Elm Street was usually full of life with a garden that Mrs. Miller tended to every weekend, but for the last 3 days, it had become a place of absolute despair where the only sound was the humming of the refrigerator and the quiet sobbing of a woman who was watching her niece disappear. Sandra sat at the heavy oak kitchen table looking so small that her feet dangled inches above the floor, and in front of her sat a plate of cold broccoli and 3 boiled potatoes that had been sitting there for hours. She did not look at the food, and she did not look at her aunt because her eyes were fixed on a blank spot on the linoleum floor where a dog bed used to be, and she stared at that empty space with a focus that was frightening to witness. Hi, my amazing friends and family. Welcome back to Vigilant Heart Tales. Before we jump deep into today's story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing all your names and countries. And don't forget to check out the other stories on the channel. Tomorrow I've got another crazy one coming that I know you'll enjoy. Alright, let's get into it. To understand why a simple bowl of vegetables had become a life-or-death battlefield, you have to understand the silence that had taken over Sandra's life 2 years ago when a car accident took her parents and left her without a voice. Since that terrible day on the highway, Sandra had not spoken a single word to anyone, not to her teachers and not to the doctors and not even to her Aunt Miller, who loved her more than anything in the world. The trauma had locked her voice inside a fortress of grief that nobody could break through, and for a long time, Mrs. Miller thought she had lost the little girl forever because Sandra moved through the house like a ghost who was waiting to vanish. But then came Betty, who was not a fancy dog with a pedigree or a special service vest, but a rescue dachshund with short stubby legs and a coat the color of a shiny new penny and a tail that never seemed to stop moving. When Mrs. Miller brought Betty home from the shelter 6 months ago, she didn't expect a miracle, but that is exactly what she got, because the moment Betty saw Sandra curled up on the couch, the little dog didn't bark or jump but simply crawled up and laid her warm head right on the little girl's chest. That heavy, warm weight was the anchor that pulled Sandra back to reality. And for the first time in 2 years, Sandra had reached out and buried her fingers in the dog's fur and whispered a single word. From that moment on, Betty was not just a pet. She was the air that Sandra breathed and the reason she woke up in the morning and the only reason she felt safe enough to close her eyes at night. They did everything together, from brushing their teeth in the bathroom to sitting in the garden while Mrs. Miller pulled weeds. And Betty even had a special way of making sure Sandra ate her dinner by nudging her leg under the table until a piece of chicken accidentally fell on the floor. Betty was the bridge between Sandra and the rest of the world. And without that bridge, Sandra was stranded on an island of silence that was getting smaller every single day. But then came last Tuesday, a day that started like any other but ended with the back door kicked in and the house ransacked by thieves who took the television and the laptop and Mrs. Miller's jewelry box. Those things could be replaced, but the thieves had also left the back gate wide open. Or maybe they had taken the dog because small breeds were easy to sell for quick cash on the street. When Sandra came home from school and saw the leash hanging empty by the door and the bed missing from the kitchen corner, she didn't scream or cry or run around the neighborhood calling out names. She simply collapsed inward, as if the strings holding her up had been cut, and she sat down on the floor where Betty used to sleep and turned into a statue. The decline was so fast that it terrified Mrs. Miller because by the next morning Sandra refused to drink her orange juice, and by the second day she wouldn't look at her toast, and by the third day, which was today, her skin had turned a pale gray color and her eyes had lost their light. Officer Jonathan Cruz had been the one to take the initial report on Tuesday, and at the time, he had treated it like any other burglary in a city that was full of crime, writing down the details in his notebook and handing Mrs. Miller a case number while explaining that stolen dogs rarely come back home. He had been tired that day and thinking about his own dinner and his own problems, so he hadn't really looked at the little girl sitting on the floor, or maybe he just didn't want to see the pain in her eyes because it was too much to handle. But now, standing in the kitchen on Friday evening and hearing the doctor say that Sandra's heart was failing from grief and starvation, Jonathan felt a heavy stone of guilt settle in his stomach because he realized he had failed this family. He looked at Sandra's thin arms and the way her collarbones poked against her shirt, and he saw his own daughter in her face and knew that a police report was just a piece of paper that could not save a life. The doctor packed up his bag and gave Mrs. Miller a sympathetic look before walking out the door, leaving the three of them in a silence that felt loud and suffocating. Mrs. Miller wiped her eyes with a dish towel and tried one more time, picking up the fork and holding a piece of potato towards Sandra's mouth, begging her to eat just one bite for Betty because Betty would want her to be strong. Sandra didn't even blink, and she didn't move her head away. She just sat there completely frozen as if she had already left her body and was just waiting for her heart to stop beating so she could go wherever Betty had gone. Jonathan watched this scene and felt a surge of anger rising in his chest, not at the little girl for being stubborn, but at the unfairness of the world and the cruelty of people who would steal a child's lifeline for a few dollars. He knew what his sergeant would say if he called it in, that he should file the medical report and let the hospital handle it because a stolen dog was a low-priority case that didn't justify overtime or resources. But Jonathan looked at the chart Mrs. Miller had taped to the refrigerator which tracked Sandra's food intake for the week, and every single day had a big 0 written in red marker, and he knew that if he walked out that door and went home to his warm house, he would be letting a homicide happen in slow motion. He cleared his throat and the sound made Mrs. Miller jump because the room had been so quiet, and he asked her in a low voice if the dog had a favorite toy or something that belonged to it. Mrs. Miller looked confused by the question, but she went into the living room and came back with a rubber chicken that was chewed up and missing one foot, and she handed it to Jonathan with a trembling hand. Jonathan took the toy and looked at it, noticing the little teeth marks all over the yellow plastic, and he realized that this cheap piece of rubber was more valuable to Sandra than all the gold in the world. He put the toy in his pocket and looked at Sandra, hoping she would look up at him, hoping she would see that he was trying to help, but she kept her eyes glued to the floor. He wanted to promise her that he would bring Betty back, but he knew that police officers shouldn't make promises they couldn't keep, especially to children who had already lost everything. Instead, he turned to Mrs. Miller and told her that he was going to go back out and check a few leads, even though he didn't technically have any leads and he was officially off duty. He walked out the front door and into the cool evening air, and the moment the door clicked shut behind him, the mask of the professional police officer dropped and he let out a shaky breath. He walked to his patrol car and sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel so tight that his knuckles turned white, and he looked at the dashboard clock which read 7:30. He had maybe 2 or 3 hours before the ambulance would have to come and take Sandra away to a sterile hospital room where they would tie her down and force-feed her, a trauma that the doctor had said might break her mind permanently. Jonathan reached over and turned off his police radio because he didn't want dispatch asking him where he was going or why he wasn't signing off for the night. He was going to a part of the city where patrol cars didn't usually go alone, a place down by the shipyards where stolen goods and stolen animals were traded in the dark. He knew he was risking his badge and his pension and maybe even his safety, but the image of that little girl staring at the empty spot on the floor burned in his mind. He started the engine and pulled away from the curb, driving slowly at first until he was out of the neighborhood, and then he pressed his foot down on the gas pedal. He wasn't driving toward the police station to file paperwork. He was driving toward the shadows to find a copper-colored Dachshund, and he told himself that he was not coming back until he had that dog in the seat beside him. The city lights blurred past his window as he drove, and he thought about the thieves who had taken Betty, wondering if they had any idea what they had actually stolen. They probably thought they had just taken a pet, a simple animal that barked and ate and slept. but they didn't know they had stolen the voice and the heart of a 7-year-old girl. Jonathan felt a fierce determination take over his body, a feeling that was stronger than the fatigue of his long shift. Because tonight he wasn't just a cop enforcing the law, he was a father fighting for a child's life. He remembered a snitch he used to know named Weasel who operated out of the back of a liquor store near the docks. A man who knew everything about the underground trade of pets and rare breeds. It was a long shot and a dangerous one, but it was the only card Jonathan had left to play, so he turned the wheel and headed toward the river. The deeper he drove into the industrial district, the darker the streets became, and the feeling of hopelessness that had filled the kitchen on Elm Street began to replace with a cold, hard focus. He touched the rubber chicken in his pocket one more time as a reminder of his mission, and he whispered to the empty car that he was coming for Betty. He knew the odds were against him, and he knew that finding one small dog in a city of millions was like finding a needle in a haystack. But he also knew that miracles sometimes happened if you were willing to kick down enough doors to find them. He parked his car 2 blocks away from the liquor store and checked his service weapon, taking a deep breath of the damp river air before stepping out into the night. This was where the real work began, and Jonathan was ready to tear the city apart brick by brick if that's what it took to get Sandra to eat a single potato. He moved quietly through the alleyways, his eyes scanning the shadows, looking for the man who might hold the key to saving a little girl's life. He wasn't Officer Cruz anymore. He was just Jonathan, a man on a mission, and he wasn't going to stop until the silence in that kitchen was broken by the sound of a happy bark. Jonathan turned the steering wheel sharply to the left and guided his patrol car away from the safety of the suburban streets and toward the industrial district where the streetlights were broken and the shadows stretched long across the cracked pavement, because he knew that filing a report was not going to save Sandra, but finding her dog might just be the miracle she needed. He drove with a heavy foot on the gas pedal while his mind replayed the image of the little girl staring at the empty floor, and the anger in his chest burned hot enough to keep him warm despite the chill of the night air coming through the cracked window. He reached into his pocket and touched the rubber chicken Mrs. Miller had given him, squeezing it gently as a reminder of the promise he had made to a child who couldn't even speak to ask for help. The radio in his car was silent because he had turned it off to avoid questions from his sergeant, which meant he was completely alone out here in the darkness without backup or support. But he didn't care about the risk to his badge or his safety because he was a father first and a police officer second. He pulled the car into the alley behind a run-down liquor store near the docks where he knew a man named Weasel spent his evenings trying to sell stolen watches and bad information. And Jonathan prayed that for once in his life Weasel would have something useful to say. Jonathan stepped out of the car and slammed the door shut, the sound echoing off the brick walls as he walked toward the dumpsters where a small figure was huddled against the cold. Weasel looked up with wide, nervous eyes and tried to scramble away, but Jonathan was faster and blocked his path, looming over the smaller man with a look of desperate intensity that made Weasel freeze in his tracks. Jonathan didn't waste time with pleasantries or standard police questions. He simply grabbed the front of Weasel's jacket and pulled him close, asking in a low and dangerous voice if he had seen a copper-colored Dachshund come through the area in the last 3 days. Weasel tried to play dumb at first, stammering that he didn't know anything about dogs and that he was just minding his own business. But Jonathan wasn't in the mood for games, so he pressed Weasel against the brick wall and told him about the little girl on Elm Street who was starving to death because her heart was broken. He described Sandra's hollow eyes and her thin arms, and he told Weasel that if that little girl died, he would make it his personal mission to ensure that every petty criminal in the district paid the price. Weasel swallowed hard and looked into Jonathan's eyes, seeing a man who was pushed to the edge. And finally, the thief cracked and whispered that he had seen a blue van parked down by the old cement factory near the river. Weasel explained that a guy named Sykes was running a business selling stolen purebreds out of the back of the van, and that he had seen a crate with a small brown dog just a few hours ago. Jonathan let go of Weasel's jacket and stepped back, feeling a surge of hope that almost made his knees weak, and without another word, he ran back to his patrol car and started the engine with a roar. The drive to the cement factory felt like it took hours, even though it was only 10 minutes, and Jonathan's hands gripped the steering wheel so tight that his knuckles turned white as he navigated the potholed roads that led to the river. He parked the car a safe distance away from the factory and turned off the headlights so he wouldn't spook anyone. Then he stepped out into the tall grass and began to move quietly toward the massive concrete structure that loomed against the night sky. He could see the faint glow of a lantern coming from behind a pile of rusted metal beams, and as he got closer, he spotted the blue van that Weasel had described. It was a rusted wreck of a vehicle with mud tires and blocked-out windows, and Jonathan's heart hammered against his ribs as he crept closer, listening for any sign of life. He heard the low murmur of a man's voice counting money and the soft, scratching sounds of animals moving in cages, and that sound confirmed everything he needed to know. Jonathan drew his service weapon not because he wanted to use it, but because he didn't know if Sykes was armed, and he moved quickly to the rear of the van where the doors were slightly ajar. He didn't yell or announce his presence like he was trained to do at the academy. Instead, he ripped the door open and shone his heavy flashlight directly into the eyes of the man sitting on a bucket inside. Sykes screamed and covered his face, dropping a stack of cash onto the dirty floor of the van as Jonathan shouted for him to get on the ground and stay down. The element of surprise worked perfectly, and within seconds Jonathan had Sykes handcuffed and sitting in the dirt outside the van. But Jonathan didn't care about the criminal right now because his attention was entirely on the crates stacked in the back of the vehicle. He climbed inside the smelly van and shone his light on the cages, seeing a poodle that looked terrified and a pug that was panting with thirst. But in the bottom crate, shoved into the corner, was a small lump of copper fur that wasn't moving. Jonathan's heart stopped for a second as he reached out and unlocked the cage door, whispering Betty's name into the darkness. The lump of fur shifted, and a long snout poked out, followed by two big, floppy ears that perked up at the sound of a gentle voice. Betty let out a tiny, high-pitched whine and crawled toward Jonathan's hand, licking his fingers with a dry tongue that told him she was dehydrated but alive. Jonathan scooped the dog up into his arms, feeling her small heart beating fast against his chest, and he wrapped his heavy jacket around her to keep her warm. He looked down at Sykes and told him that a patrol unit would be coming to pick him up, but Jonathan wasn't going to wait because he had a delivery to make that was more important than any arrest record. He carried Betty back to his car and placed her on the passenger seat, and the moment she saw the rubber chicken lying there, she let out a happy yelp and wagged her tail so hard that her whole body wiggled. Jonathan smiled for the first time in 3 days as he put the car in gear and turned on his sirens, not to chase a bad guy, but to clear the road so he could get a little girl's best friend home before it was too late. The drive back to Elm Street was a blur of flashing lights and adrenaline, and Jonathan talked to Betty the whole way, telling her that they were almost there and that she needed to be a good girl and eat her dinner so Sandra would eat hers too. When he finally pulled up in front of the house, the lights were still on in the kitchen, and he could see the silhouette of Mrs. Miller pacing back and forth past the window. Jonathan grabbed Betty and tucked her under his arm like a football, running up the walkway and bursting through the front door without knocking because there was no time for manners. The scene in the kitchen was grim, with Sandra slumped over in her chair looking more like a rag doll than a child, her eyes closed and her breathing shallow, while Mrs. Miller sat with her head in her hands, looking defeated. The sound of the door opening made Mrs. Miller jump up, and when she saw Jonathan standing there covered in dirt and sweat, she started to ask what happened, but Jonathan didn't say a word. He walked straight to the table and knelt down beside Sandra's chair, his presence filling the room with a sudden energy that made the air feel electric. He whispered Sandra's name softly, and the little girl's eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes that were dull and glassy from days of starvation and sorrow. Jonathan smiled at her and slowly unzipped his jacket, pulling the fabric back to reveal the surprise he had fought so hard to retrieve. Betty didn't wait for an invitation. She scrambled out of the jacket and leaped onto Sandra's lap, letting out a joyful cry that sounded like pure happiness. The change in Sandra was instant and miraculous, like a light switch being flipped on in a dark room. Her eyes widened, and her mouth opened in a gasp as she felt the familiar weight of the dog on her legs and the wet tongue licking the tears from her cheeks. Sandra wrapped her thin arms around Betty's neck and buried her face in the soft fur, sobbing loudly and uncontrollably, releasing all the pain and fear she had been holding inside for days. Mrs. Miller let out a cry of relief and covered her mouth, sliding down the cabinets to the floor as she watched the reunion that she had prayed for but didn't believe would happen. Jonathan stood up and wiped a smudge of dirt from his forehead, feeling a lump in his own throat as he watched the little girl and her dog. But he knew the job wasn't finished yet because the reunion was only half the battle. He pulled out a chair and sat down at the table right next to Sandra, taking his police hat off and placing it gently on the tablecloth. He looked at the plate of cold potatoes and broccoli that had been the enemy for so long, and then he looked at Sandra, who was still hugging Betty as if she would never let go. Jonathan cleared his throat and said in a calm voice that Betty looked very hungry after her big adventure. But he reminded Sandra that the rule in this house was that dogs didn't eat alone. Sandra lifted her head and looked at Jonathan with red, puffy eyes, and then she looked down at Betty, who was staring at the food on the plate and licking her chops expectantly. The little girl sniffled and wiped her nose on her sleeve, and for the first time in days, there was a spark of life in her expression, a tiny glimmer of the child she used to be before the world went quiet. Her hand trembled as she reached out toward the plate, her fingers hovering over a piece of potato while the room held its breath, waiting to see if love was enough to overcome the darkness. Sandra picked up the potato and broke it in half, her movements slow and shaky, and she held one piece out to Betty, who gently took it from her fingers and swallowed it in one gulp. Then, with everyone watching, Sandra slowly lifted the other half of the potato to her own lips and put it in her mouth. She chewed slowly, and as she swallowed, Mrs. Miller let out a sob that was pure joy, and Jonathan felt a tear roll down his own cheek, which he quickly brushed away. Sandra picked up a piece of broccoli next, and then another potato, feeding Betty and then feeding herself in a rhythm that was beautiful to watch. Jonathan reached across the table and took a fork, stabbing a piece of cold potato for himself because he wanted to be part of this meal, part of this family that had been put back together by a stubborn cop and a copper-colored dog. He took a bite and smiled at Sandra, telling her that the food wasn't bad but it could use a little salt, and Sandra looked at him and let out a tiny rusty laugh that sounded like music. The kitchen, which had been a place of silence and death just an hour ago, was now filled with the sounds of chewing and sniffing and the soft murmurs of comfort, and as the night went on, Jonathan knew that he would probably get in trouble for ignoring his radio and breaking protocol, but looking at the color returning to Sandra's cheeks, he knew it was the best decision he had ever made. He stayed there until the plate was empty, watching the girl and the dog curl up together on the rug, safe and sound. And he realized that sometimes the most important police work didn't happen on the streets, but right here at a kitchen table. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this story. If you enjoyed this story, I promise you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more thrilling as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.